Saint Joseph is the most underestimated figure in all of heaven. Not because heaven underestimates him, but because we do. The saints have always known what most people alive today have quietly forgotten: that Joseph carries an authority in the invisible world that no other human soul possesses, except his wife. And Padre Pio, who prayed to him for decades with a consistency and urgency that surprised even those closest to him, once told a friar that Joseph was the one saint he would never stop asking for help, because Joseph never refused. Not once. Not anyone who genuinely asked him. That claim sounds almost too strong to leave unexamined. Good. Because what Padre Pio understood about Saint Joseph was not something he arrived at through study or reading. It was something he saw, something he lived from the inside, something that shaped every Mass he offered, every prayer he breathed in the dark before dawn, every soul he tried to pull back from the edge of a ruin they had not yet recognized they were approaching. What he knew about Joseph runs far deeper than a prayer card or a novena booklet. And once you understand what Padre Pio actually taught and what he witnessed across 50 years of spiritual sight, your relationship with Saint Joseph will never look quite the same again. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina was a Franciscan friar who lived in the remote south of Italy in the early 20th century. He bore the wounds of Christ, real, open, bleeding wounds on his hands, his feet, and his side, for 50 years. He could read souls the way a doctor reads a patient's face before a word has been spoken. He could sense the presence of evil entering a room before it made itself visible in any outward way. He could see the guardian angels standing beside people as they walked through his confessional door, as clearly as he saw the wooden screen and the folded hands and the light shifting through the small window above them. None of this was pious embellishment. It was documented, examined by church authorities, witnessed by thousands of people over decades, and ultimately impossible to dismiss on natural grounds. The invisible world was not, for Padre Pio, a subject for debate or speculation. It was as solid and present as the stone floor beneath his feet. More solid, actually, because the stone floor would eventually wear away, and the invisible world would not. Within that world, his devotion to Saint Joseph stood apart from even his other great loves. Those who shared his daily life in San Giovanni Rotondo noticed it. The friars who overheard his prayers in the early morning hours, who watched him counsel the desperate and the broken across decades, who heard what he returned to again and again when someone brought him a crisis they had no words for. They noticed that when he pointed someone toward Joseph, there was something particular in how he did it, a certainty that bordered on authority, not the certainty of a teacher recommending a practice, more like the certainty of a man introducing someone he trusts completely to someone who has never once failed him. To understand that certainty, you have to understand what Joseph actually is. In Catholic theology, Joseph holds the title Patron of the Universal Church. That title sounds ceremonial. It is anything but. Think about what it means. The same man who was trusted with the physical protection of Jesus Christ, who kept the Son of God alive through a midnight escape into Egypt, who built walls with his own hands, who provided and guarded under conditions of poverty and danger and complete uncertainty about the future. That same man now holds a corresponding office in the spiritual realm. His mission did not end at his death. The tradition holds that it was perfected by it. Everything he did on earth for the body of Christ, he now does in heaven for the body of Christ, which is the Church. Every soul in it, every person who calls on him from anywhere on earth. The scale expanded beyond all measuring. The faithfulness did not change by a single degree. Padre Pio understood this not as devotional language, but as a working reality. He saw it in operation. And across the years, whenever people came to him broken, by failed marriages, children lost to the world, faith shattered by war, grief carried too long in silence, he returned again and again to the same name: Joseph. Go to Joseph. Among the many who made that journey to San Giovanni Rotondo in the years after the Second World War, there were countless people carrying the particular damage that conflict leaves behind, in ways no doctor could diagnose. Picture one of those long mornings when the line outside the church formed before sunrise, when dozens of men and women waited in the cold without speaking, each holding something they had been carrying for years. Imagine a woman in that line who had traveled days to get there, a savings scraped together because there was no other option left she had not already tried. Her husband had come back from the front with his body intact, but something behind his eyes permanently altered. He could not sit through a mass without something in him going cold and closed. He could not pray. He was present at the table every evening and completely absent at the same time, in a way that was worse, somehow, than being gone entirely. She had no name for what had happened to him. She had no road to reach the place where he had retreated. What Padre Pio reportedly told her was unexpected. He did not lead with the rosary, though the rosary was at the center of his spiritual universe. He pointed her directly to Joseph, and specifically, according to those who were nearby that day, he asked her to pray for her husband's fatherhood to come back. Not his faith first, but his fatherhood. Because Joseph understands something that no other intercessor understands in quite the same way. The specific weight a man carries when the world has hollowed something essential out of him. The specific kind of grace that reaches a man not through argument or exhortation, but through the part of him that still knows, somewhere, that he is supposed to be the one standing guard over what he loves. That distinction is not a small one. Joseph was not a passive figure. This is what the deep tradition sees in him that the popular imagination tends to flatten. We picture him at the edge of nativity scenes, older, gentle, slightly peripheral to the central drama, a lily in his hand. That picture is nearly backwards. The man chosen to father the Son of God was not chosen because he was unintrusive. He was chosen because he could carry impossible weight without breaking, because his obedience was unconditional and immediate, and because he could be trusted with the single most important assignment in all of human history, and never waver. When the angel told him to take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt in the middle of the night, he did not wait for morning. He did not deliberate. He got up. He moved. His faith was not contemplative. It was physical, active, muscular, and without hesitation. And that same quality lives in his intercession now. When Joseph moves on behalf of a soul that calls on him, he does not move slowly. What Padre Pio's spiritual gift allowed him to perceive, through years of early morning prayer and long nights of interior life, was something like a vision of how Joseph's intercession actually operates. The invisible mechanism behind the visible effects that those who prayed to him consistently kept reporting back across the decades. If we try to put into words what a spirit attuned like Padre Pio's might have seen, the picture could be described something like this. Joseph's intercession does not operate at the surface level of a soul's life, on the feelings or the visible choices or the events a person can name and track. It works deeper. It works on the foundation, on the load-bearing walls of a person's interior structure, the parts that hold the weight of everything built on top of them, the parts that most people never examine because they hold without complaint until the day they don't. And when a family prays to Joseph, something enters that foundation. Not dramatically, not loudly. It enters the way warmth enters stone, slowly, invisibly, thoroughly, until the cold that had accumulated for years is replaced by something that allows life to continue where it was beginning to fail. Padre Pio saw this process at work in the families of the people who came to him. He watched, over years, the difference between the households where Joseph was prayed to faithfully and those where he was not. The difference was rarely dramatic in the moment. It was legible over time. The families that held together through pressures that should have broken them. The marriages that survived what similar marriages did not. The children who found their way back when all the logic of the situation said they were gone. There is something else that those who studied Padre Pio's spiritual life noticed in the accounts passed down about him. Whenever he described the invisible assistance given to souls who prayed to Joseph faithfully, he used language that was different from the language he used for other forms of spiritual help. Other graces, he seemed to suggest, could be delayed or redirected by the resistance of the soul receiving them. The soul that keeps saying no eventually finds fewer doors open. But Joseph's intercession, at least as Padre Pio seemed to understand it, had a quality of patient persistence that was almost structural. It did not give up. It did not thin out. It simply continued, the way a root continues growing through stone. Not in a single dramatic breakthrough, but through the steady, invisible application of something that will outlast whatever is resisting it. Padre Pio seemed to consider this one of the most distinctive qualities of Joseph's help. It was not dramatic, but it was relentless. There is something else that those who studied Padre Pio's spiritual life noticed in the accounts passed down about him. Whenever he described the invisible assistance given to souls who prayed to Joseph faithfully, he used language that was different from the language he used for other forms of spiritual help. Other graces, he seemed to suggest, could be delayed or redirected by the resistance of the soul receiving them. The soul that keeps saying no eventually finds fewer doors open. But Joseph's intercession, at least as Padre Pio seemed to understand it, had a quality of patient persistence that was almost structural. It did not give up. It did not thin out. It simply continued, the way a root continues growing through stone. Not in a single dramatic breakthrough, but through the steady, invisible application of something that will outlast whatever is resisting it. Padre Pio seemed to consider this one of the most distinctive qualities of Joseph's help. It was not dramatic, but it was relentless. The craftsman quality in Joseph matters here more than it first appears. He built things. He took raw wood in his hands and shaped it into something useful and durable. Furniture that could bear weight. Structures that gave shelter to people who needed it. Padre Pio, who worked with his own hands in the monastery garden and understood the dignity of ordinary labor deeply, recognized something essential in that. The same hands that made things durable in Nazareth work now on making things durable in the invisible realm, on shoring up what is at risk of coming apart, on repairing the invisible framework before the visible structure collapses. He builds quietly, without announcement, in the ordinary background of lives that are going forward without noticing the maintenance being done on them. Now consider what Joseph's actual relationship to God was, because Padre Pio's confidence in his intercession was rooted specifically there and nowhere else. Most saints intercede by bringing your request before God. They add their voice to yours. They advocate and plead and stand alongside you at the invisible threshold. And that intercession is real, and it works. But Joseph's position was particular in a way that belongs to no other human soul in history. He was not merely a great servant of God, or a beloved friend of God, or even a magnificent saint of God. He was the man who, on earth, stood in the role of father to God's own son. He fed him. He taught him to use a saw. He carried him across a foreign border in the dark of night to keep a king's soldiers from killing him. He built him a bed. He taught him the names of the birds around Nazareth. That relationship, whatever its ultimate depth, left a mark on eternity that is unlike any other mark left by any human soul. The Church has always said, and the mystics confirm, that God honors Joseph the way a son honors a father, not from obligation, but from love. Because that love was real on earth, and real love is not erased by death. It is perfected by it. Padre Pio held that understanding not as a theological proposition, but as a lived certainty. When he went to Joseph, he went as someone approaching the man who had held God as a child and kept him alive while the world wanted him dead. There was reverence in it, and a deep confidence, and those two qualities fed each other rather than pulling in different directions. The confidence was not presumption. It was the confidence of someone who knows they are standing at exactly the right door, speaking to exactly the right guardian, about precisely the kind of need they carry, not because of their own worth, but because of who they are approaching. The accounts passed down by those who lived alongside him describe his early morning prayers before Joseph's altar as quiet, specific, and almost conversational. The way you speak to someone whose faithfulness has been so consistent for so long that you no longer need to argue your case or build your appeal. You just need to ask. Padre Pio seemed to have reached, through decades of experience, a place of complete interior ease with Joseph's intercession. Not casualness, certainty. And certainty is what happens when you have been shown, enough times, that the one you are trusting will not fail. There is a particular connection between Joseph and the Mass that Padre Pio understood clearly and rarely spoke about directly, but that those closest to him felt in the way he carried himself to the altar every single morning. The Mass, for Padre Pio, was not a ceremony. It was the same sacrifice as Calvary, made present again. The same death, the same offering, the same act of redemption made available to every soul alive. He wept during Mass. He trembled. He sometimes could barely complete the words. And in the invisible realm, what he saw during those long morning Masses was a transaction of grace happening on a scale that staggered him every single time, no matter how many decades he had been a priest. Joseph had been present at the beginning of that mission. He had protected the life that would eventually be offered on the cross. He had kept alive, in a small house in Nazareth, the body that would one day be broken for the life of the world. And the Mass, every morning, was the completion of what Joseph had guarded. Padre Pio believed, and the tradition behind him supports this, that praying to Joseph before Mass, or asking Joseph's intercession for souls at the moment of the Mass, was a way of honoring that chain of faithfulness, of connecting the original protection of the sacrifice with the fruits of the sacrifice. The mystics who came before Padre Pio had said similar things about Joseph and the Mass, but he understood it in a way that was not borrowed from their writings. He understood it from what he saw at the altar. The offering on the altar was the same life that Joseph had protected through poverty and exile, and ordinary years of anonymous labor. Every time Padre Pio raised the host, he was holding up what Joseph had once carried in his arms through the dark streets of a foreign country in the middle of the night. That continuity between the protection of the Incarnation and the fruits of the Passion was alive to him in a way that shaped how he prayed and who he called on. Joseph was not peripheral to the Mass in Padre Pio's spiritual world. He was the man who had made the Mass possible by doing what he was asked to do in hiddenness with everything he had. The mystics who came before Padre Pio had said similar things about Joseph and the Mass, but he understood it in a way that was not borrowed from their writings. He understood it from what he saw at the altar. The offering on the altar was the same life that Joseph had protected through poverty and exile and ordinary years of anonymous labor. Every time Padre Pio raised the host, he was holding up what Joseph had once carried in his arms through the dark streets of a foreign country in the middle of the night. That continuity, between the protection of the Incarnation and the fruits of the Passion, was alive to him in a way that shaped how he prayed and who he called on. Joseph was not peripheral to the Mass in Padre Pio's spiritual world. He was the man who had made the Mass possible by doing what he was asked to do, in hiddenness, with everything he had. This is what he passed on to others, and the instruction was always the same. Go to Joseph regularly, not only in emergencies. Build familiarity with him before the crisis comes, so that when it comes, you are not a stranger knocking on an unfamiliar door. You are a child waking a father who has been sleeping with one ear open, already listening for exactly that sound, already prepared to rise. The protection of families was, of all the things Padre Pio pointed people toward Joseph for, the most consistent thread. Not because a title says so, but because it was Joseph's actual lived work. He did it. He held a household together through conditions that should have made it impossible. and every grace connected to that particular mission. A marriage at the edge of collapse beginning to stabilize, a father's hardness beginning to soften, a child who had drifted beginning slowly to turn back, the quiet restoration of prayer in a house that had gone silent. Every one of those graces passes through the hands of the man who first built that kind of home under impossible circumstances. What Padre Pio seemed to see clearly was how spiritual danger enters a home. Almost never dramatically. It enters through small gaps, through a father's gradual absence from prayer, through a mother's grief that goes unnamed and therefore untreated, through a child's isolation that everyone notices and no one addresses, through the slow replacement of what is sacred with what is merely comfortable, not in a single moment, but across dozens of ordinary evenings until the evening without prayer becomes the default, and no one can point to the exact moment the shift happened. Joseph guards against exactly that erosion, not through dramatic visible interventions, through the kind of quiet, persistent faithfulness that prevents the damage from accumulating in the first place. The same way a well-built roof keeps the rain out not by a single act of dramatic resistance, but by being exactly what it is supposed to be, every single day, in every season. The practice this calls for is simpler than most people expect. Begin with Him before anything in your household is already broken. Tell Him what you are protecting. In your own words, without formulas, the way you would speak to someone you trust to know what to do with what you share. The marriage, the children, the faith beginning to thin at the edges, the relationship beginning to cool. Ask Him to stand guard in the ordinary days, not just the emergencies, in the evenings and the mornings, and the unremarkable days when nothing dramatic is happening, but the foundation is always either being maintained or quietly neglected. Then watch for the small signs, because those are the real ones. A conversation that resolves more easily than you expected. A child who comes home. A husband who sits at the table one evening and is, without any explanation, more present than he has been in months. Without knowing what changed, without being able to say why the heaviness lifted. These are not accidents. They are the fingerprints of a guardian doing his work in the hidden places, while you go about the visible business of your ordinary days without seeing the mechanism. Padre Pio watched this mechanism operate for 50 years. He watched what it produced in the lives of the people who committed to it. He recommended it with the certainty of someone who had seen it work, not from theory, but from witness. And then there is this last thing, the one that, in many ways, is the fullest expression of everything Joseph represents. He is the patron of a holy death, not as an honorary title, but because of what his own death actually was. The tradition holds that Joseph died with Jesus and Mary beside him, the two holiest souls who have ever lived, holding him, accompanying him through the door of death, as he had accompanied them through so many dangers in life. No human being in history has ever died more beautifully than that. And the Church holds, and the mystics confirm, that he carries something of that same grace to every soul that calls on him at the end. Not a guarantee of the circumstances, a promise of company, that the crossing will not be made alone. Padre Pio had seen that crossing up close more times than anyone should have to. He knew what made it terrible and what made it peaceful. He prayed to Joseph, for himself, for the friars around him, for the thousands who wrote to him asking for help at the end of their lives and the lives of those they loved, for exactly that grace, the grace of not crossing alone. There is one more thing worth naming, something Padre Pio seemed to understand about the nature of Joseph's hiddenness itself. For most of us, hiddenness feels like a loss. To do good work and have no one see it. To protect and provide and guard and have no record written down. That kind of invisibility registers, in our ordinary understanding, as a kind of failure. We measure significance by visibility. Joseph spent his entire life measuring it by faithfulness. And what Padre Pio grasped, through his own decades of suffering that no one outside the monastery could see, through his own long years of doing the most important work of his life in a small stone building far from the centers of anything, was that the invisible faithful work is not lesser. It is foundational. The whole visible cathedral rests on the stones buried in the ground that no one ever sees and no one ever thanks. This is the hidden power, not hidden because it is a secret, hidden because it belongs to quiet, to ordinary mornings and ordinary households and prayers breathed in the dark before the rest of the world wakes up. Because it was given to the man who embodied all of that, a carpenter from a small town who held God in his arms and never needed a single person to know it. Joseph's power is the power of faithfulness maintained without witness, the power of a door guarded every night without exception, year after year, because the one standing at that door knows exactly what lives inside and considers it worth everything. Padre Pio knew this. He lived inside that protection for 50 years, and what he passed on, to the friars, to the penitents, to the women who traveled for days to stand in line before dawn, to the men whose faith had been broken by the worst century in living memory, was the same truth he had arrived at through decades of witness. The door is open. The guardian is at his post. He has never left. And the prayer you breathe toward him tonight, in the quiet of your ordinary house, is exactly the kind of prayer he has always understood best. The man who kept God alive through the night is still keeping things alive. He is still at his post, still faithful in the hidden places where the most important things are preserved. And what you place in his hands tonight, he will not set down.